After a few years working in a hospital, I stopped being afraid of death. But there's something that never stopped unsettling me. The people who reach the end of their lives completely alone almost never realized they were heading in that direction. And that always stayed with me, because when we think about growing old alone, we imagine something sudden. A major loss, a dramatic break, something big enough to explain it. But that's not how it happens. Most of the time. There's no exact moment where everything changes. It's a series of small things, almost unnoticeable, that slowly build up until one day, there's no one left around. My name is Aina. I've been a nurse for 11 years, and during that time, I've witnessed many different kinds of stories. But some follow a pattern so quiet that, if you're not paying attention, it feels like each case is unique, but it isn't. I started noticing it in the details. Not in the major events. In rooms where the phone almost never rings. In patient records where the emergency contact field is incomplete or repeated. In patients who say, "There's no need to call anyone," with a calmness that doesn't match the situation. At first, I thought it was just circumstantial. Maybe their family lived far away. Maybe their children were busy. Maybe it was temporary. But over time, I began to notice something else. These people hadn't just become alone recently. They had been alone long before they needed help. The difference is that, while they were still independent, it went unnoticed. Even by themselves, they could still go out, handle their responsibilities, fill their time. And that created the illusion that everything was fine. But their connection with others was already fading. And no one notices when that starts. There's no clear warning. No specific day where someone decides, "This is when I'll drift away from everyone." It's more subtle than that. Conversations postponed, visits that stop happening, messages that get slower until they disappear. And the hardest part to recognize is that, while all of this is happening, life keeps functioning. Nothing breaks right away. Nothing feels urgent enough to be seen as a problem. And maybe that's why this pattern is so common. Because it doesn't feel dangerous in the beginning. It only reveals its weight when there's no way back to what used to be. Now, when a patient arrives, I don't just look at their condition. I watch who shows up, who calls, who asks about them. And sometimes, the silence around a person says more than any test result. Because in most of the stories I've witnessed, loneliness didn't start in the hospital. It just became impossible to ignore there. There was a patient I never forgot. He was admitted on a Tuesday afternoon. The beginning of a quiet shift, nothing unusual. Simple name, older age, stable condition. The kind of case that doesn't stand out. But there was one detail that almost went unnoticed. He arrived alone. No family member brought him in. No one waiting outside. No companion by his side. Just him. And a small bag with a few clothes. I remember while I was doing his intake, I tried to make light conversation. Asked if someone would come visit him later. He answered without hesitation, "There's no need to call anyone." And it wasn't said with sadness or anger. It felt automatic, like someone who was already used to not expecting anyone. His name was Joe. He had a very organized way about him, almost meticulous. He folded his own clothes before putting them away, lined up his belongings on the bedside table, adjusted his pillow several times until it was exactly how he wanted. Small gestures of someone still trying to hold on to control over what he could. In the first few days, his routine was quiet. He woke up early, even when he didn't need to. Sat for long periods just looking out the window. Not really watching anything specific, just looking. When the staff came in, he was polite, answered everything clearly, never complained. But he never tried to start a conversation either. And in a hospital, that says a lot. Because most people, when they're there, try to hold on to any kind of interaction. They ask questions, make comments, tell stories. Anything to break the silence. But Joe didn't. He seemed comfortable in silence. Or maybe he had just gotten used to it. On the third day, I noticed something. The phone in his room never rang. Not once. And that might sound like a small detail. But after working there long enough, you learn to notice patterns like that. Some patients get calls all the time. Others at least once a day. But then there are those whose phones simply never ring. And Joe was one of them. I checked his chart again. There was a contact number. But it was his own. No other names. No references. Nothing. That night, during medication rounds, I tried talking a little more. I asked where he lived. He gave me the neighborhood, and then went quiet. I asked how long he had lived there. He paused for a few seconds before answering. Long enough. There was no resistance in the way he spoke. But there was no openness either. It was like every answer was measured. Enough to end the conversation, not continue it. And even without him saying it directly, you could feel that this quiet routine hadn't started there. The hospital was just repeating something that was already part of his life. On the fourth day, something simple happened. But it was the kind of thing most people would never notice. During visiting hours, every room around his had movement. People coming in and out, bringing bags, talking, sometimes even laughing quietly. And his room stayed exactly the same. No interruption. No presence. No change. I walked past the hallway and for a moment stopped at his door. He was in the same position as always, sitting, looking toward the window. But this time, there was something different. It wasn't obvious sadness. It was something else. A kind of absence, even though he was there. As if he no longer expected anything to happen. And that's when I started to understand. The silence around him wasn't circumstantial. It was structural. As the days went by, small things started to change. Nothing drastic. Nothing that on its own seemed important. But when you're paying close attention, you realize it's those details that tell the whole story. Jobo started taking longer to get out of bed. Before, he would wake up early and sit up almost immediately, as if he still had some commitment to his day. Then, he began staying in bed longer, staring at the ceiling, without any urgency. When I asked if he was in pain, he said no. And technically, maybe he wasn't. But there was another kind of wear there. Harder to measure. He also stopped organizing things the same way. The bedside table that used to be perfectly aligned became slightly messy. Nothing extreme, just enough to show something had shifted. And this happens far more often than people realize. Loss of autonomy rarely arrives all at once. It seeps in. First through small things. Almost symbolic. Getting out of bed. Folding clothes. Responding with the same clarity. Until, little by little, those small losses begin to pile up. And the hardest part is that, from the outside, everything still looks under control. Joe was still lucid. He answered when spoken to. There was no significant clinical decline at first. But his rhythm wasn't the same anymore. And you don't see that in medical tests. One night, I walked into his room and found his dinner tray almost untouched. I asked if he didn't like the food. He paused for a few seconds before answering. I wasn't hungry. But it didn't feel like a lack of appetite. It felt like a lack of reason. Over the next few days, he began relying more on the staff. Simple things he used to do on his own. Adjusting his pillow. Reaching for objects. Calling someone for things he once handled quietly, and this didn't come with complaints or visible frustration. It came with acceptance. A quiet acceptance that from the outside feels heavier than resistance. Because when someone is still fighting the loss, there's energy there. But when they simply accept it, it usually means they're already tired of trying to hold everything together alone. There was one moment that stayed with me. I was helping him sit up, and for a brief second, he held onto my arm a little tighter than necessary. It wasn't panic. It was hesitation. Like, for just a moment, he realized he truly needed help. And not just in that moment. In life. He let go right after, as if nothing had happened. That gesture said more than any words, because it wasn't just his body giving in. It was the entire structure that supported his independence. And the hardest part to accept is that none of that started there. The illness may have accelerated the process, but the path had been built long before. Quietly. Without urgency. Without anyone, not even him, realizing that, little by little, it was becoming harder and harder to go back. It was only after a few days, watching that quiet pattern repeat itself, that something started to make sense to me. Because until then, it would have been easy to say it was all because of age, or illness, or simply the absence of someone at that moment. But it wasn't that. Joe Bow wasn't alone because he got sick. He was sick, and there was no one there. And that order changes everything. Because from the outside, it looks like loneliness is the final outcome. Like it's something that happens after life has already gone wrong somewhere along the way. But most of the time, it's not the ending. It's the process. It's something that gets built over the years. So quietly that no one notices when it crosses the line. And it was there, in that room, that I understood something I've never forgotten. The loneliness that shows up at the end of life almost always started long before, when there was still time to do something different. It just didn't feel urgent. It didn't feel dangerous. It felt like routine. And Joe wasn't an isolated case. Far from it. After him, I started recognizing the same pattern in other patients. Different stories. Completely different lives. But with something in common that only became visible at the end. People who once had active lives. Who worked, built things, made decisions, but gradually reduced the space for relationships. Sometimes by choice. Sometimes out of exhaustion. Sometimes because of small conflicts that were never resolved. And over time, their circle got smaller. No dramatic break. No announcement. No clear moment where everything changed. It just shrank. Until one day, when life demanded more support than independence, there was no longer enough structure to hold them. And the hardest part to realize is that throughout that entire process, they didn't see themselves as lonely. They saw themselves as independent. And there's a very subtle difference between those two things. But in reality, that difference only becomes clear when you can no longer carry everything on your own. That's what Joey showed me, without ever having to explain it. And after I understood that, I've never been able to look at certain kinds of silence the same way again. After Joe was discharged, I never heard from him again. And that says a lot too. Because there are patients you remember for what happened, and others for what was missing. And in his case, what stayed with me the most was the feeling that none of it had started there, and probably didn't end there either. Over the years, I've seen that same ending repeat itself in different ways. Not identical, but similar enough that it's not a coincidence. And that's when this realization became harder to ignore. People don't suddenly become alone in old age. They become alone gradually, little by little, through decisions that seem too small to matter. Through distances that feel temporary, but never return to what they were. Through relationships that don't really end. They just fade out of existence. And maybe the most uncomfortable part of all of this is that while it's happening, it doesn't feel like a problem. It feels like a choice. It feels like routine. It can even feel like control. But there's a very thin line between living alone and having no one left when you truly need someone. And that line is almost never noticed. When it's crossed, it only becomes clear. When there's no way back. I'm not saying this as a warning or as advice. It's just something that after so many years, I can't unsee. Autonomy doesn't disappear all at once, but it gets handed over. Little by little. And by the time you need it the most, sometimes, it's already gone. And so is everyone else.